Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Paraclete Press, welcome to the launch of Andalusian Hours, Poems from the Porch of Flannery O'Connor by Angela Alaimo O'Donnell. I'm Rachel McKendry, the book publicist here at Paraclete. In these days when it's not possible to be together with Angela to celebrate the launch of this incredible collection of sonnets, we are so grateful to be able to gather online, so thank you for joining us. A recording of our time together will be available later on to share with anyone who couldn't make it, and we'll also let you know how to get a copy of Andalusian Hours and Angela's other books with Paraclete. And there will be a time later on for questions for Angela, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit those, and hopefully we'll get to everyone. Angela Alaimo O'Donnell, PhD, is a writer, poet, and professor. She teaches English, creative writing, and courses in Catholic studies at Fordham University in New York City, and serves as Associate Director of Fordham's Curran Center for American Catholic Studies. She is also co-editor of the Curran Center's new book series, Studies in the Catholic Imagination, the Flannery O'Connor Trust series, published by Fordham University Press. In addition, she has recently received the good news that the Flannery O'Connor Trust is bestowing a grant for $450,000 to the Curran Center in response to her application to endow international conferences devoted to promoting O'Connor's work. Thank you so much for this amazing work, Angela, and congratulations.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for inviting me to do this book launch. And thanks to all of you for coming into my living room in order to do this book launch. It's a really wonderful opportunity to talk about this project that I'm very excited about. And I hope that you enjoyed hearing these poems and hearing about these poems as much as I have enjoyed writing them. I'll start, I think, by just mentioning some background information about the project that you might be interested in. First, I've been reading Flannery O'Connor stories for many years. I started when I was a freshman in college, and the first time I read one of her stories, I was just completely mystified, and I thought it was wild and it was crazy and it was funny and it was sad at the same time. I never had read a writer who had packed so many different kinds of emotions and so much power into such a short space of words, at least in prose. So I knew she was somebody I wanted to get to know better, and I did. I studied her as an undergraduate, I studied her as a graduate student, and then I taught her stories for many years. So Flannery has kind of haunted me for many years. I've also written a number of books about Flannery O'Connor. I wrote a book about her prayer life called The Province of Joy, which was published by Paraclete Press. I also wrote a brief biography of O'Connor called Fiction Fired by Faith. I recently wrote a book called Radical Ambivalence, which is about Flannery O'Connor's relationship to race. And of course, all the while, or at least for the last several years, I have been working on this book as well. So I spent a lot of time reading Flannery's letters and reading her essays, and of course, reading and teaching her stories. So her voice is very much inside of my head. I feel like I communicate with her on a regular basis. So it occurred to me now it's about 3 years ago, that maybe one of the ways of dealing with this constant presence of O'Connor in my mind would be to externalize her voice and put it on the page. So I wrote a poem, which was basically about Flannery looking around at the place where she lived, Andalusia, the farmhouse that she lived in rural Georgia, in Milledgeville, and trying to reconcile herself to living in this place, which was very far from the place that she had just come from and wanted to be, the literary center of the United States, New York City. And the poem was actually really fun to write, and it came very naturally. I enjoyed channeling O'Connor's voice and personality. And it's actually quite a relief for a poet, because poets, we spend an awful lot of time inside of our own heads. And it was a joy to really kind of get out of my own head and be able to enter into Flannery's way of seeing the world. The writer Henry David Thoreau says, "There's no greater miracle that can befall us than to see the world through another's eyes." And I was beginning to see the world through Flannery O'Connor's eyes. And the world looked very different than it does through my own. So I wrote another poem, and I wrote another poem, and gradually over the course of about 2 years, I accumulated well over 100 poems. And I realized that they were a kind of collection. They were amassing themselves into a kind of collection. And that's the idea then for Andalusian Hours. couple of other things I'd like to say. First of all, most of you know who Flannery O'Connor is, I'm sure, but for those of you who might forget little bits about her biography, I will just remind you that she was born in 1925. She died in 1964. She was born in Savannah, Georgia, and lived there for the first 13 years of her life. And then at that point moved to Milledgeville, Georgia, which is about an hour and 15 minutes from Atlanta, very rural place. Her family had a house in town, but they also had a farmhouse outside of town called Andalusia. And that farmhouse is still there, as is the house in town, and you can go visit it. I hope you will. Once she moved to Milledgeville with her mother, first of all, life there was quiet, but also Flannery was she was a very good student. She was not in a conventional way, but she was obviously passionate about books. She also was very attached to her father. Flannery was an only child, and her dad seemed to have the kind of sense of humor that Flannery had, and she was very close with him. Her mom had different ideas about how Flannery ought to grow up, Regina. She was from a big Catholic family of Southern women, and she kind of wanted Flannery to grow up to be a proper Southern lady. Flannery had different ideas about what she wanted to do with her life. So there was always a little bit of friction between the two. And of course, friction between mothers and daughters makes for very good literature. So she lived with her parents in Milledgeville. Sadly, her father died when she was 15, and it was a devastating experience for her. He died of lupus, and she had watched him become ill, get sicker and sicker, and then finally leave her life. She stayed in Milledgeville for college because she didn't want to leave her family behind. But eventually, when she was 20 years old, she went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she met some very important and influential writers. And that launched her on a career to become one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century. After she spent a couple of years there in Iowa, she went to New York, to upstate New York, to the famed Yaddo Colony for Artists. And there she also met some very influential writers and publishers. Flannery was very fortunate to meet somebody who wanted to publish her first book. She's not even 25 years old yet, and she's still working on it. And she was able to make connections in that literary world, so that she found herself at the age of 25 with a very promising beginning to be a great writer, the great writer she wanted to be. And then unfortunately, she got very ill. One Christmas time, she went home to Georgia, and she was diagnosed with lupus, the same disease that had killed her father. So for the next 13 years, Flannery had to live at home with her mother, the mother she doesn't get along with very well, in a farmhouse in Milledgeville, Georgia, and make the best of that situation, trying to become a great writer in the middle of nowhere. It is there that Flannery wrote her 31 stories, her 2 novels, plus an unpublished novels, and many essays, and the hundreds of letters that she wrote, upon which her reputation as a great American writer rests. So she is a person who we can kind of get to know very well, because her volume of work that she produced was not enormous. And so you could read all of Flannery O'Connor in a summer or in a month if you wanted to read something every day. But you can also get to know her very well through her letters. And she writes letters to everybody. She corresponds with strangers and friends alike. And those letters are very intimate and very funny and witty and sassy and wild and strange. And I recommend that you read them. The book is called The Habit of Being. And if you want to get to know Flannery O'Connor better, that's a great way to do it. These particular poems that I wrote, each one begins, except for 2, each one begins with an epigraph from one of Flannery's letters, or from her stories, or from her essays. And then the rest of the poem sort of delves into what she was thinking about, what she may have been thinking about, to try to, in some way, discover what is at the root of these often hilarious, often fascinating, often very rich and deep sayings that she says. So the poems actually are engendered by O'Connor's own words. And then the poem that I write, I'm again channeling O'Connor and hoping that these poems sound like her. So I hope that's not too long an introduction, just to give you an idea of what this project is about. The poems are all sonnets, as Rachel mentioned. I love the sonnet. I'm kind of addicted to the sonnet. And what I love about them is they're very short, but very pithy. You can get a lot into 14 lines. And you can also, it's a very elastic form. All of these poems have rhyme and rhythm. Sometimes the rhymes are kind of hidden, sometimes they're half rhyme, but every sonnet has a kind of a musicality and a structure within which what Flannery says is made musical, is made to appeal to the ear as well as to the mind and to the eye. And so I hope that comes across in these poems as well. So maybe what I'll do is stop talking and read some of the poems. The book does have a kind of narrative arc of chronology. It starts early and then moves to Flannery's later life. And so I'll roughly follow that chronology in choosing some of the poems that I'll read. But this is the very first poem. This is the poem that generated the book. And it's called Flannery Rising. Waking early, I took the Georgia light as a sign from God of the wrecked world's end. The nimbus of sun bleached the barn white, hailed from the east like a wandering saint. The bright one, the abbot would most likely send out on a mission. That barn needed paint. The boards were rotting, the roof like to cave. It somehow escaped my mother's keen eye for spoil and squalor, all kinds of decay. Mine too. These soft bones dissolving inside my skin in a gunny sack race to be dust. The red wolf might lame me, but not my lust for this life, this world about to expire. I stand in the light. I welcome the fire. That expression, by the way, the red wolf, is the expression that Flannery uses in her letters to describe lupus, which the word lupus comes from the Latin root of that means wolf. I'd like to read a poem about an early experience that Flannery had. She said it was her favorite experience of her childhood. When she was living in Savannah, she loved to raise birds. Her passion for birds lasted her whole life. As she got older, she raised peacocks. But when she was a child, she liked to collect pet chickens. And she liked chickens that were kind of odd. You know, they had mismatched eye colors, or they had extra wings, or they were missing a foot. She liked oddity because Flannery, in some ways, felt that she herself was odd. This only child with a deep interest in books and in chickens. So she would sew little clothes for her chickens, and she would also teach them to do interesting things. And one of them included teaching one of her chickens to walk backwards. And so this poem is called Flannerys Fame. When I was 5, I had an experience that marked me for life. Pathé News sent a photographer from New York to Savannah to take a picture of a chicken of mine who had the distinction of being able to walk either forward or backward. The cameraman came as a big surprise, as much of a surprise as how much I liked it. A star starting its easy rise against the flat Savannah sky. It was such a rush to have all those adult eyes trained on me and my trained bird. The hush of expectation assured me that I was different, the kind of child folks sought out, took moving pictures of and bragged about. I was going to be famous if I died trying. But the bird disdained the fame I hungered for. She would not walk the walk. I write stories now, but it's not the same as the day they flocked to gape and to gawk. Another very interesting thing about Flannery O'Connor is that she was Catholic growing up in the Protestant Bible Belt South. Catholics were not very common in Georgia at the time when she was growing up. And so Flannery, another reason that she felt like she was a little bit of an oddball or a freak, a word that she liked to read, or use rather, is because of this Catholic temperament that she had and her Catholic upbringing, which makes children odd in various ways. Those of us who are Catholic don't know how odd we are, but then every now and then someone will point it out to us. It's frequently pointed out to me because I'm also helplessly Catholic, another link between myself and Flannery. So this particular poem deals with a story of Flannery's, which is basically autobiographical. It's called The Temple of the Holy Ghost. Some of you may have read it. And the little girl in the story, who is unnamed, is almost definitely a version of Flannery. So as she's falling asleep at night, she's always trying to figure out whether she should be a martyr or a saint. And she finally concludes this conversation in her mind where she says, She could never be a saint, but she thought she could be a martyr if they killed her quick. Flannery considers her options. So many ways to go, it's hard to say. Cracked on the rack, hang and beaten, boiled in oil, flayed and splayed, eaten by beasts starved for your skin. Anyway seems rough. It's persistence that counts, how long you can stand it, the pain being less than the terror. It amounts to grit, to nerve, and if you're insane, it helps. When they set you on fire, pound in the nails, cut out your heart, you'll smile, though your prospects are dire. Praise your butcher, plying his art. You can savor the taste of the trauma. Sit back and enjoy the drama. Another interesting thing about growing up Catholic is that Catholic children are encouraged, forced in many ways, to think about death from a very early age. When I went to visit the Flannery O'Connor childhood home a number of years ago, and it's another place I hope that you'll get to go to in Savannah, right by her little crib is right in front of the window. And when you look out the window, St. John the Divine Cathedral is right there across from the square, which is where Flannery was baptized and where her family went to church. When the little child looked up at the wall, there was a crucifix there. And a crucifix in a Catholic home, of course, is a cross with a body on it, a tortured, mutilated body, basically, a dead body, a body of the dead Christ. So from very early on, children see this symbol in their home, and they recognize it as being the destiny of all human beings, this death. And of course, representing the hope that there's something beyond, there's a life beyond this one. So Flannery spoke to this in many ways in her writing, but one particular line in her book about her conversation stood out to me. She says, "I'm a born Catholic, and death has always been brother to my imagination." This poem is called Flannery's Twin. I'd be an only child except for him, sleeping in my room with me at night, our twin beds side by side. When we toss the rock for hopscotch, he always rolls a 10. One-footed, I teeter and bend to snatch that stone and hop home safe and whole. Whatever game we've played, he's never lost. Quick at jacks, sharp at cards, fast and light on his feet when we skip rope. My role as his sister is to keep him amused, lest he should grow bored and try to leave. I tell him stories, make him believe he is invincible when he is not. He's a fool, but he's the only brother I've got. So maybe we'll move a little bit past Flannery's childhood now. I mentioned earlier Flannery's very interesting relationship with her mother, Regina Klein O'Connor. When she came back to live at Andalusia with Regina, they had a very interesting daily relationship. First of all, Flannery lived a very orderly life. She got up in the morning, she had a cup of coffee with her mother, they went to 7 o'clock mass at the local church in Milledgeville. They came home and had breakfast, and then she would lock herself in her room for at least 2 hours and she would write. For her, that time was sacrosanct, and it was a kind of an opportunity for her to it was a form of prayer, writing was for her, really, and is one of the ways in which Flannery sees the relationship between her vocation as an artist and her vocation as a Catholic. But then after she finished it, and they would have lunch together, they would go to the local Sanford House restaurant and have lunch, she and her mother, and then they would come home and spend the rest of the day together, which could be purgatorial some days, judging from the things Flannery says in her letters. So she has all sorts of very, very witty and funny stories about not getting along with her mother. But this is one of my favorites. She says in a letter she wrote to one of her friends, "I always thought that if she had a dog, she'd name him Spot, without irony. If I had a dog, I'd name him Spot, with irony. But for all practical purposes, nobody would know the difference." This is called Flannery's Existential Thoughts While Porch Sitting. I almost envy her darkness, or should I say her light, the way she sees the world like a lazy river sliding along its banks, while I see the fish deep beneath, forever driven by the current, held in harness by a force that can't be reckoned. My mother's never had a second thought about the justice of this life. One day you're swimming, next day you're caught, hauled up and out, gutted with a knife, no matter how hard you tugged, how long you fought. She holds on to hope, thinks it's never too late. I know we all end up on someone's plate. I might say a word or two about Flannery's love life. She fell in love 3 times, so far as we know. Once when she was in college with a young man who then went off to fight in the Second World War. She exchanged letters with him, and then when he came back, he joined the seminary. That was a disappointment, as you might imagine, for her at least. The second time, there was an interesting fellow who came to town selling textbooks. His name was Eric Langer. And local people thought, well, since he's interested in books and Flannery out there in Andalusia is interested in books, those two should meet. And they did meet, and they had a very brief kind of flirtation and romance. Unfortunately, it ended with him going back. He was from Denmark. He was a Dane, going back to Denmark to go to graduate school, meeting a woman and sending Flannery a note that he was going to marry her. So that also ended in disappointment. And there was one more relationship that she had, which really was very one-sided. She fell in love, as young girls sometimes do, with an older person, Robert Lowell, who was a very handsome, charismatic poet that she met at Yaddo. And he was married. He was in the middle of a divorce and had another wife. And he was not. He loved Flannery, but in a very different way than she did. So there are poems in here about those 3 men particularly. But there's one I'd like to read that I think says a little bit about Flannery's attitude towards marriage. Let me find it. Sorry. Yeah, I see page 80. It's a little later in the book. This one is called Flannery Considers Marriage. And the quotation comes from her story, Good Country People, in which this is said about the main character, but it could be said about Flannery. She looked at nice young men as if she could smell their stupidity. Flannery considers marriage. They aren't stupid, really. They just aren't smart in the way smart women need them to be. Not a whiff of humor, no rabbit-quick wit, no gift for seeing human hilarity. A slowness of the head, as well as the heart, that makes them dull, marks them unfit companions on the long and lonely road we all have to walk. I love to talk as much as the next girl, but who wants to know about spark plugs and tires, strikes, runs, and walks, kicking that extra point over the goalpost? I'd fall asleep in my cornflakes, wed to all that. Each day a trial to be got through, the smell of stupidity, coffee, and toast. Flannery also writes some poems about her work. She was very dedicated and very devoted. And one of the things I love about O'Connor is she was a person who was humble before her art, and she knew her limitations. But she also was very self-confident. She knew the work she was doing was good, and she was trying to write for the ages. So there is this combination of self-deprecation that you find in her letters, but also she knew who she was, and she knew how good she was. And as an artist myself, I can only admire that confidence that she had as a young woman, certain of her gifts. So there are a number of poems about Flannery's attitude towards her art, and I'd like to read one called Flannery's Pottage. This begins with an epigraph that appears in the Conversations of Flannery O'Connor. O'Connor once got a letter, and the letter, and this is what she says about it. Some old lady said that my book left a bad taste in her mouth. I wrote back to her and said, you weren't supposed to eat it. Flannery's Pottage. I can't help wondering what it tasted like. Burnt biscuits, buttermilk gone sour, potato salad that's turned in the sun. I suppose the tang of fact is bitter. It doesn't set kindly on the tongue. But I know no other way to cook, to tell a story, or to write a book. Evil, sin, and just plain old mistake will salt my stew, no matter what I do to keep them out. They are the spice of life, unsavory and unsweet, flavor so true you can slice it thick with a butter knife. Chicken pot pie made with spoiled chicken, It seems my typewriter is my kitchen. Another thing that's remarkable about Flannery's work, both her poems, rather her stories, and she didn't really write poetry. She wrote a couple of poems, and one of them she sends to a friend, her friend Sally Fitzgerald, and she says, "Here's a poem I wrote. I hope you like it. I don't write much poetry. I think it's a filthy habit for a fiction writer to get into." So I think it's kind of amusing that here's a book of poems about Flannery. I practice my filthy habit creating this book of poems about Flannery's sense that poetry is a waste of talent and time. But anyway, one of the powerful things about her letters and her stories, of course, is that her faith is so important to her. It's always, always in there. It's always part of her stories, even if it's not obvious, and it's always part of her letters, sometimes in very obvious ways. Flannery served as a spiritual advisor to a number of people who wrote to her. She actually is responsible for the conversion of one of her friends, an epistolary friend, Betty Hester, who's known in the letters only as A. So she really took very seriously her vocation as a Catholic. She read voluminously in theology. She was very, very much a self-taught theologian. And she makes a number of very brilliant observations about the nature of life, the relationship between the human and the divine, her sense of who God is and what God means to her in her life. So I'd like to read a couple of those poems about her faith. One of them is called Flannery's Eschatology, Flannery and Eschatology. Flannery, as I mentioned earlier, raised peacocks. At one point, she had 40 peafowl on her property. These irritated her mother to no end, by the way, because they ate up all her flowers. Another way in which they didn't get along. But Flannery was unstoppable. She was addicted. She would order more and they would keep reproducing. So peacocks form a big part of her imagination. She loved the way that they fanned their tail because the peacocks, the eyes that you kind of see in the peacock feather, I actually can show you a picture that might help us to envision this. This is the cover of my book for Paraclete Press, The Province of Joy. You can see that, you know, their feathers look like they have these beautiful eyes. In the Middle Ages, they sometimes represented the eyes of the church. The peacock was also a symbol of Christ and a symbol of revelation. So they figure very prominently in her stories and in her letters as well. And this particular poem engages or involves a peacock. Flannery is telling a story in her wonderful essay, The King of the Birds. And she says, "A truck driver driving up with a load of hay found a peacock turning before him in the middle of the road. He stopped and shouted, 'Get a load of that bastard,' and braked his truck to a shattering halt." This is Flannery and Eschatology. It'll be like that, the second coming. Making your way laden with hay down some old local road, and there you are, stopped dead by Christ, with no idea what to say in the face of such transforming glory. Helpless, without a code to die by, tact is sacrificed, and candor coughs up the words we need. He was a bastard, truth be told, his father being not of this world, but the hidden one we just can't see until a blue-plumed vision stalls your truck, leaving you blind and wonderstruck. One of the interesting things about peacocks is, as I'm sure that you know, those of you who had experience with them, they fan their tails when they like. You can wait and wait and wait for a very long time and they won't fan their tails. And when they do, it's just such splendor. And so this particular man driving in his truck got a taste of that, or a glimpse of that splendor, and enjoyed it. Another thing about Flannery's spirituality is she believed that the creation is good, basic Catholic teaching. The creation is good. It was made by God. It is blessed. And even though it's full of problems and wickedness and ugliness and sorrow, it's a gift to be enjoyed every day. And this little poem is about what it might have been like for Flannery to wake up every day in Andalusia, even though there were other places, more exciting places, more interesting places that she might have wanted to be. And this poem is called Flannery's Fire. And the epigraph comes from her story, A Good Man is Hard to Find. It says, "The trees were full of silver white sunlight, and the meanest of them sparkled." Flannery's fire. That's the beauty of it, living here, where the sun comes daily and the trees seem lit from within. Some secret fire igniting the world which sparks but does not flame. The same fire's inside me, so I know what it is to burn low, with no one seeing the quiet glory you are, how bright your leaves, and every polished stem just gleaming in the white light. What it means to be mean and still lovely, and loved by the maker who made you that way, full of wonderless lust and mad hot wit. It's not something you see every day unless you live here. So I stay. Flannery's ideas about what a writer's job was basically to help the world to see the beauty and the power of the creation and the divinity that the fact that the creation is shot through with divinity. So one of my favorite quotations about the role of the artist and the role of anybody who really is a Christian is this one that comes from one of her letters. She says, "If you believe in the divinity of Christ, you have to cherish the world at the same time that you struggle to endure it." This poem is called Flannery's Hard Teaching. Not just love, but cherish the world. From the Latin caris to the French cher, meaning dear, meaning costly, beloved, meaning hold to your heart, handle with care. This world, from Old English wereld, meaning human race, meaning age of man. This world, meaning our earth and her heirs, meaning all of us here, now, if you can. The serial killer, the crooked cop, the war-worn refugee at the door, the racist, the rapist, the shooter and shot, the filthy rich and the dirty poor. This world, ever ancient and ever new. Not just love it, but act like you do. And I'll read just a couple more, and then we can open it up for questions. One of the things that Flannery, when she was a student at Iowa, experienced was a fear that she would lose her faith. As I mentioned earlier, she grew up in the Bible Belt. She was always surrounded by people who were believers. And then, of course, she was part of this big extended Catholic family in Milledgeville. She had all of her mother Regina's aunts around all the time. They went to church every day. They were regular communicants. So suddenly, when she went to Iowa at the age of 20, she was surrounded by people who did not believe. Many of whom actually thought that if you were a person of faith, somehow you lost IQ points. So she was really, she wrote a beautiful journal, and if you're interested in O'Connor, I highly recommend it. It's called A Prayer Journal, and it came out a few years ago, and I don't know if you can see it, but it's a very beautiful series of letters that Flannery writes to God, in which she expresses to him her concern about losing her faith. And so I'd like to read one of those poems, a poem actually that comes from one of those letters. She says, this is at the very end of the prayer journal, and she's speaking to God. She says, "What I am asking for is really very ridiculous. Oh Lord, I am saying at present, I am a cheese. Make me a mystic immediately." Flannery's prayer. Sometimes I tire of waiting for the transformation, the moment I move from milk product to holy hallelujah, halo on my head instead of rind, my smell suddenly sweet instead of sour, a rose growing amid the dairy farm of life. My mama and my proper Catholic aunts pray for rain, good weather. Won't they be surprised to learn what their odd daughter hankers for? Wisdom to light on me like a pet bird, pecking its feed from my open hand. Vision that penetrates walls and doors, that shut me up and away from your love. The stuff that cheeses like me dream of. Of course, one of the big challenges of O'Connor's life was to deal with her lupus. To be stricken with a disease which at the time was almost certainly a mortal illness. There was no medication that could cure. There still is no cure, but at least we have some medications that allow people to manage it better. At the time, O'Connor took heavy-duty steroids, and in some ways, the steroids were more destructive than the disease. They caused her hip to crumble, her jaw to begin to disintegrate. She had to walk with crutches. So it really was a terrible illness for her to have to deal with daily, especially in a person who was so young. So she lived with her mortality in front of her all the time. And it's probably one of the reasons she worked so diligently, because she didn't ever really know how much time she had. So she writes very movingly about her illness. And let me just read a couple of those poems. One of them is called Flannery's Lupus. And the poem begins actually with a reference to the romantic poet John Keats, whom I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Keats contracted tuberculosis. He lived in the 19th century and was dead of it by the age of 26. And the fact is, few of us who ever talk about Keats, whenever we talk about Keats, we also talk about his TB, his tuberculosis, as though the two things were absolutely inseparable. And the same thing has happened to a certain extent with Flannery. Her lupus is an important part of her story, but she resisted that. And she says in one of her letters, "I don't want further attention called to myself in this way. My lupus has no business in literary conversations." Flannery's Lupus. Like Keats and TB, an afterthought for me. Some folks just won't leave it alone. As if my body's weakness infects my mind. As if my life's work could be defined by a germ or a gene that's killing me, slow and sure. When it's the work that keeps me alive, makes up what of me will finally survive the onslaught of inevitability. What wakes me up and what keeps me going when my body says no, 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 no. The wound that teaches me how to live, to the stranger, distant and tentative, is private as prayer and of no concern. It's a lesson you need to be sick to learn. As Flannery became sicker and sicker, and her story is so powerfully told in those letters, she still kept working. She brought her stories to the hospital with her and hid them under her pillow so that the nurses wouldn't find them and take them away from her. And she wrote 3 of her best stories, or at least finished them up working on them when she was very sick in the last year of her life. So she, as she was getting sicker and sicker, she was still very mentally present, very aware of what was happening around her. And that includes when she received last rites. And this poem is called Flannery in Extremists. And it comes from one of her letters that she wrote 8th of July, 1964. This is just 4 weeks before she dies from lupus. She says, "Yesterday, the priest brought me communion, and it looked like a long time before I'm afoot. I also had him give me the now called sacrament of the sick, once known as extreme unction. I like the old name better than the new, containing as it does the Latin root, for those in extremis, meaning dying, not sick. Sacraments ought to tell the truth. When he blessed my ears and eyes, lips and hands, I felt how lucky I'd been that they were mine. For how else would I know and love the world were it not for these gifts I've received? And now there's another gift I want. Time. Oh, I know we all have to go, leave this life for the next. But I'm perplexed. Pearl gates and angels, celestial bands of hymn-singing saints are not my speed. This green earth is all the heaven I need." Some of these poems are very private. There is really a sense in them of, in some ways, invading Flannery's privacy as she's thinking about love, as she's thinking about her mother, as she's thinking about her own mortality. It's been asked of me by more than one person who knew about these poems early on, that don't I think that it's presumptuous of me to take on her personality and to channel her and to pretend that I know what her thoughts and words might be. And my answer to those people is yes. Absolutely. It's very presumptuous. And this is what artists do. It's an act of imagination to be able to enter into the mind and heart and soul of another human being. It's impossible to do, but it's something we try to do over and over and over again. It's something that love really compels us to do. Um, and I'm hoping, of course, that these poems are true to Flannery, and that they're faithful and that they're loyal to her spirit and to her memory. Um, but nonetheless, I decided that the last poem in this book ought to be a kind of apology. There's only one poem in this book that's written in my voice, and it's the last one. And it's the last one I'll read. And it's called Poet's Apology. But softly, Flannery, the light rises, and you and I both know the time has come when you will have to go. Forgive me for these trespasses on your private mind. I have grown to love you. You've become my friend, my boon companion, my sister self. I speak for you while you stand there, silent, kind blue eyes glinting behind your thick glasses, telling me it's more than okay. It's been fun, living through the living when you're dead. All pretense, all formality is shed when your tongue is in my head. It took stealth and nerve to steal your mind and heart. Now I see, as you walk toward the light, how lonely I will be. So thank you for your kind attention to these poems. I would love to hear some feedback from you, any questions that you might have, or any comments.
Thank you so much for that, Angela. That was fascinating. Your teaching, your reading, your sonnets, just amazing. Thank you so much. And I have to say a personal thank you to you for reading my very favorite poem in this whole collection, Flannery's Prayer. I just love that. We do have so many questions. A few people actually submitted them a day or so ago before the reading. So John Paul McKinney and Bob Klein are both asking about the identity of a Catholic author. They're asking, what makes an author Catholic? Is it the author's faith, the subject matter of their work? So I don't know if you would be willing to talk about that for a moment.
Absolutely, I'd be thrilled to. I can answer that both from Flannery's perspective, why she's a Catholic writer, and then also my own perspective as a Catholic writer. I think that the content has very little to do really with a Catholic writer can write about anything. And there are as many subjects and as many ways to be a Catholic writer as there are Catholic writers. I think really what makes a Catholic writer Catholic is the way that he or she perceives the world. There are just certain, it's a worldview that one gets as a result of having a Catholic formation. Earlier I mentioned Flannery's, growing up, with crucifixes around your house and being encouraged to think about your mortality, think about human limitation and human brokenness as a condition of your life all the time. I also mentioned this, the Catholic belief that the world is good, and that it's blessed, and that the incarnation, the fact that God inserts himself into the world demonstrates that goodness and bears it out physically. The importance of the body, and the joy of being embodied is also an important part of any Catholic writer's way of seeing the world. If we think of the really classic writers, Catholic writers like Dante, there's no more physical writer than there is Dante when he describes, the horrible things that happen to people in the Inferno, and then of course as he ascends into purgatory, and then the joy of the glorified body in the Paradiso. So there is a kind of a worldview. Another important thing is the fact that death is not the end of things, and the belief in the communion of saints. There's always the sense that the dead never really leave you, that they're always with you. I think this book is a testament to that. Flannery is not here physically with us anymore, but she's still very much alive in many ways. And it's partly because she left behind this wonderful body of work, but again, believing in the communion of saints, she's also part of this communion that we all are a part of, and all will join even more fully when we go into the next life.
Thank you so much. Sort of related question. Amy Uelman says, death, she's quoting, "Death has always been brother, Catholic, children, and death. I love that image of keeping him entertained lest he leave. This theme seems especially poignant in light of the dramatic crisis that we are living now. As you review these now, further thoughts about what Flannery has to say to us today?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, I think Flannery is more, she's always relevant, but she's more relevant now than ever. For one thing, she lived with death in front of her every day, just as we are suddenly being forced to do. As a culture, we don't do that. As a culture, Americans run away from death, deny death, hope it's never going to happen to us. We're very naive. And O'Connor never did that. And so death, and when we read her stories, some people are very disturbed by her stories because people die in them and terrible things happen to them. But she always returns us over and over again to this reality, And the fact is that that we are often constantly, as well as being reminded of a mortality, we're constantly offered grace. And the forms that grace takes are sometimes not what we expect them to take. Illness can be a form of grace. With O'Connor, she talks about her own illness as being, to have been sick is to travel to another country where no one can follow you. And in many ways, that has really given her the strength to be, and the vision that she has to be able to write. She says in another one of her letters that, with one eye squinted, I could take it all as a blessing, including her own illness. So I think one of the things that we're being invited to do in the time that we're living right now is to say, okay, it's a pandemic, it's a pestilence, it's a curse. But there's no doubt that there's grace that's coming out of this. I mean, we see the grace in the people who are the heroes who walk down to Lawrence Hospital a couple of blocks from my house every day and go in there and bravely, arm themselves and fight this disease. There's grace cropping up all around us. So I think that O'Connor's vision is perfectly in keeping with a time of pandemic. Absolutely. She lived in a state of pandemic for herself, at least.
Well, you're answering the next question, and you spoke about it earlier. Marilyn was asking, what did Flannery write that reflected her battle with lupus? So you've talked about that. Is there anything else you want to tell us about that?
I think I would recommend reading the letters because she is so brave and she also maintains her sense of humor. Some of it is gallows humor, of course, but she maintains her sense of humor in the face of this terrible disease that she knows is eventually going to beat her. But she's going to fight it, and she's going to do her darndest to make the best of the situation. So I think the letters are probably, because she really only speaks with people who are close to her, and these are what you get in the letters. She doesn't really write about it. Although it's interesting, there are some stories, a lot of stories, in fact, that contain characters who are disabled in some way or have some kind of physical limitation. So, for example, in the story Good Country People, her main character, Hulga, has a heart condition. She has very bad eyesight. She also has lost one of her legs. And Hulga, unfortunately, does not take these as opportunities of grace. She takes them as just affliction that she has to deal with. So O'Connor likes to write about afflicted characters because it was one way of channeling her own affliction and the ways in which she could deal with it in her stories.
Thank you. Jessica Brown says, this has been so wonderful. As a reader and a fiction writer and poet, I have thoroughly enjoyed it. Angela, do you have a favorite poetry craft book or a good resource, a book or an essay about crafting the sonnet, or a favorite sonnet or book of sonnets to study the form?
That is a great question. There are so many great writers of the sonnet. Shakespeare, of course, is the classic. That can sometimes be a stumbling block because obviously it's Elizabethan English, but he writes the sonnet. He pioneered in the English sonnet, so he's the best there is. But there are also a number of other really great sonnet writers. Robert Frost was a master of the sonnet. Edna St. Vincent Millay is also a wonderful sonneteer. Any sonnets by any of those people, and you will, you can just see the range of possibilities. And I'm going to be very vain here and and recommend my book, Still Pilgrim, which is the book that came out before this, as well as this book, Andalusian Hours. These books kind of, I think what's interesting about them is they take the traditional sonnet forms and they stretch it and make it do stuff that it hasn't done before in some ways, and makes them colloquial. So that's another possibility. But yes, I also would recommend two essays about poetry that are wonderful. One is Gregory Orr's essay, Poetry and Survival, that came out in 2002, I think. You can find it online. I share it with my students. Another beautiful essay is Robert Frost's The Figure a Poem Makes. And another beautiful essay is one by the terrific poet B.H. Fairchild called Lathe Work. I give all those essays to my students all the time, and they really help, I think, to understand as they're writing poetry what this craft is all about.
Thank you so much. Stephen Holmes asks, what do you think a modern day Flannery might look and sound like?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Flannery has a lot of people who admire her, and they kind of have taken on her, the ways in which she blends tragedy and comedy. So her kind of what seems like kind of madcap, crazy humor, and then also dark, disturbing, grotesque events that happen. So for example, we see in the Coen brothers films, a very Flannery O'Connor-esque grotesque sensibility. The difference, however, with the Coen brothers is O'Connor uses the grotesque in the service of this larger vision that she has. I love the Coen brothers, don't get me wrong, but I don't think they're writing out of a larger vision, and certainly not out of a Christian vision. So there's I feel as though there are lots of writers who and artists who like to kind of take on O'Connor's qualities and characteristics, but not all of them have what O'Connor has at the root of it, that these are in the service of something larger than themselves. And there are other like Southern Gothic kind of writers. Unfortunately, Harry Crews is dead, but he's another interesting Southern writer who has Flannery O'Connor-esque tendencies. Yeah, I'm always on the lookout for new writers who, and of course, the other problem is you don't want to be derivative when you write, right? So you don't really, as a writer, you don't want to sound like Flannery O'Connor because then you don't have your own voice. So it's kind of a trick to try to learn from her and appropriate some of the things that she uses to give your own work power, but you also want to distinguish yourself from her.
Thank you. Joan Wilton is asking, do you think that Flannery believed that Catholicism is the one true faith, or would she have had a more inclusive perspective?
Flannery was a pre-Vatican II Catholic. She died in 1964. And so she really didn't live to see many of the changes that happened in the church and changes in the way that the church thought about the faith. So at the time when she died, church teaching was that Catholicism was the one road to salvation. And certainly Jesus is the one road to salvation. I will say, however, that O'Connor grew up in the South, and only two of her stories really are about Catholics. All of her stories are about Protestant fundamentalist Christians. And she loved living in the South because Protestants know the Bible in ways that Catholics do not. And so they are conversant with the stories that she is drawing on in her own stories. They understand the word in ways that Catholics don't quite get. Catholics are really all about sacrament and community. Of course, we read the Bible too, but not in the very deliberate way that Protestants do. So she much admired her Protestant fundamentalist counterparts, the passion that they had for their faith, the sense of vocation that they had was something that very much informs her own Catholicism. So I don't think O'Connor would ever say, well, these people are not saved. This would be the language, of course, of her Protestant counterparts. I think her mind was bigger than that. But I will say that the church that she belonged to was a church that was still teaching that Catholicism is the only road to the faith. A church that really you weren't allowed. It's hard for us to remember this. So I don't remember it. I'm just too young. But you weren't allowed to go into a Protestant church. It was really a very, very clear division between the faiths. And one that she certainly would have welcomed the relaxation of that if she had lived past 39 and lived through Vatican II.
Thank you so much. We have a few questions here about your own process in general, and I think also specifically in writing this book. Neil Orts says, having spent so much time in Flannery's head and voice, can you feel how she's affected your own voice going forward? Or is there anyone else's voice you'd like to appropriate to your literary purposes?
That is a tricky question, which I would expect from Neil. Very good question. Yes, I definitely want to appropriate other people's voices. In fact, I think I've spent most of my life, my writing life, appropriating other people's voices. W.H. Auden says, when you create art, you break bread with the dead. Whenever I write, I feel like all the dead writers that I love are in the room with me. And there's a little bit of Seamus Heaney in what I write, and there's a little bit of Shakespeare, there's a little bit of Wordsworth, a little bit of Keats, there's a little bit of Tennyson, there's a lot of Frost, there's Emily Dickinson. They're all my buddies. They're all with me in the room, and I learn from them, I steal from them, as T.S. Eliot once said, good poets borrow, great poets steal. I steal from them shamelessly, and I hope that all of this becomes an amalgamation that produces a voice that is singularly mine. I hope that I'm not just slavishly imitating people. That having been said, one of the fun things about channeling other people's voices is, as I mentioned earlier, I'm able to get out of my own head, to use Flannery's idiom. Even though I lived in the South for many years, I was a graduate student in Chapel Hill, North Carolina for 6 years. I lived in Baltimore for 18. Southern speech falls very naturally on my ear, but I never really spoke with a Southern accent because that was not my formation. But I love a Southern accent, and as probably is evident in these poems, and I enjoyed being able to put that hat on, or put that voice on, or ventriloquize that voice when I was writing Flannery's poems. But I've also written poems from other people's perspectives as well, and I've been enjoying doing that. Biblical poems from Mary Magdalene's point of view, for example. From the point of view of the apostles, from Judas's perspective, trying to imagine their voice. So it's actually, and this is so interesting because Neil, who is my friend, is a dramatist, a playwright. I think of this as more of a function of being a dramatist than being just a poet, because you're not just talking about yourself all the time, but you're able to imaginatively, what Keats calls negative capability, enter into somebody else's imagination. And try on their voice and be them for a while. It's a great gift. In fact, Keats talks about two different kinds of poets. There's the egotistical sublime, that was Wordsworth, who always talked about himself, who was a very great and brilliant artist. And then there's the chameleon poet, and the great artist, of course, is Shakespeare, who could become anybody. He could become Ophelia, he could become King Lear, he could become Hamlet, he could be a villain, he could be a saint, he could be anybody. And so that's a pretty great goal to try to channel that ability that Shakespeare has and be a chameleon poet, as well as sometimes being the egotistical sublime.
A follow-up question from Rita. She's asking, where do you write and how often each day?
A wonderful question. Thank you, Rita. I have my same chair that I like to sit in. It's in the corner. It's right over there. It's in the corner of my sun porch. I have all my books. It's very messy. I have my books sort of spread around me. I write in longhand. I don't like to write on a computer. I've done it when I had to, but I don't like to do it. I've occasionally had to type a poem on my phone. When I was in Palestine a few months ago, and a poem came to me, and it's like, I have no paper, and so I had to type it on the phone. But I like the feel of a pen in my hand. I like the sensation of the pen touching the paper. I feel like I'm making something. I feel like I'm using my hands and mundane materials in order to bring something into being. It's a very sacramental, really. And I have my favorite pen and my favorite notebook. And I always write in the morning when language is still fresh for me. And I try to do it before I've read anything, before I've checked my email, before I've really had any conversations. And to kind of listen to, and sometimes I'm really lucky and I wake up with lines in my head. Sometimes that happens in the middle of the night. I actually have pen and paper by my bed. I'll write it down and then the next day find it. Sometimes it's terrible, but sometimes it's a line that, okay, this is a good place to start. So I find that the morning is a really good time to be able to write. And these days, I mean, I know that this has been hard for a lot of people having to be sequestered and quarantined in their house, but this is how writers love to live their lives, quarantined in their houses, because I have these hours, that unfold before me, opportunities to be able to write. So whereas normally what I would have had to do is confine my writing to an hour, maybe in the morning, and then get ready and go to teach, go to work, I'm not having to do that. So I'm finding I'm able to return to a poem that I started in the morning, in the afternoon, and start to tinker with it and live with it more than I ordinarily can live with it. But the most important thing is to write every single day, even if it's just a line, even if it's just to play with a line, because it's like any other form of exercise. The more you do it, the better you are at it, the easier it gets. And it's just important to keep engaged all the time.
Brother Robert Smith asks, do you know if Flannery ever had formal education or training in Aquinas?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. She never did really take any theology courses when she went to secular schools after, she was finished with her grade school. So there was no opportunity really to take theology or religious studies. Then she went to Iowa, and God knows that was a very secular place. So all of the reading, and this is one of the things that's so remarkable about her, all of the reading that she did in theology was entirely self-generated and self-taught. So she loved Aquinas. He was her favorite saint and her favorite theologian. She often said, people think that I'm a hillbilly nihilist when I'm really a hillbilly Thomist. And so all of her writing is shot through with Aquinas. And that just comes from, she used to read actually the Summa every night before she went to bed. When she said her last prayers, her compline at night, she would then read Aquinas until she fell asleep. So he became a habit of mind for her. And he taught her, one of the things that Aquinas taught her that was most important to her is the beauty and the necessary thing that art is. And that art is a good in and of itself, and that it's a gift from God. And that encouraged her enormously when she was trying to figure out how to, the work that all of us have to do who are writers. How do I connect my vocation as a member of the community of saints with my vocation as a writer? And some people, this might not seem like these two pursuits can go together. One seems to be worldly and the other seems to be extra-worldly, otherworldly. And for O'Connor, they weren't. And Thomas really helped her to find that, to discover that on her own.
Angela, we do have a few more questions if you have time to keep going. I know we're over the hour that we anticipated.
Oh, absolutely. I could talk about Flannery all day. So please.
Okay. All right. Here's a question from Brady Peterson.
Great.
I
know these people. I'm so happy.
Oh, good. You could probably guess the question then. Brady says, from Flannery's hard teaching, it seems I've heard you talk about the word cherish before in this way. And the word, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, world, WEORULD. Have you written about this before, or am I imagining this?
That actually is, that you have a very good ear. Yes. That poem is a poem that I wrote before this project started, but I wrote it in Flannery's voice. And it appears in a previous book. It's in Still Pilgrim. And this actually also speaks to Neil's interesting question. How much overlap is there between my voice and O'Connor's? I think that it's inevitable when you spend years reading a person and then you spend a couple of years writing from a person's perspective, there's going to be some kind of way in which you are going to sound like her, or she's going to sound like you. It's sort of like, my sister, I hope she's tuned in, when you grow up with a house full of sisters, you all talk the same. I remember when we used to have probably don't remember this, Rachel, but there was a time when there was one phone in the house, and when it rang, someone would pick it up, and no one could ever tell which of us it was, because we all sounded the same. We all spoke the same. We all had the same speech rhythms, and I think that happens when you are with people, especially if you have a kind of a musical ear, an ear for music. You pick up their accents and such. So yeah, I had already been picking up Flannery's accents when I wrote that poem, and that was before I was even conscious of the fact that I was going to do this project. So thank you um, for keeping me honest and reminding me of that, Brady.
Jessica Brown had a second question. She says, I read Mystery and Manners about 15 years ago and found it very formative, but I sometimes find it hard to infuse the reality of the incarnation into my fiction when it doesn't have the same shock value, genius weirdness that O'Connor perfected. Any thoughts about faith-inspired fiction that is a different, perhaps quieter kind of fiction?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think when O'Connor says that, and it's such a beautiful and powerful essay in Mystery and Manners, where she says God did not insert him into the world by intellectual idea. God inserted himself into the world through the body, through the incarnation. And that's the only way this is the only way human beings can know anything, through our senses. And so as writers, we have to confine ourselves to the senses, to the five senses, and create. You have to create a world. When you're a fiction writer or when you're a poet, you are creating a world that is metaphorically related to the one that we're in, but also different in some kind of way. And so there, again, as many ways to do that as there are writers. So somebody like O'Connor does it. She loves this idea of shock value because, as she says, her characters are all very much in need of grace, but their heads are so hard that nothing else but some kind of a violent action is going to make them see the grace that is extended to them. So for her, that was the way to make the incarnation felt. But there are other writers who are very incarnational, but they don't rely on that. For example, a fellow Southerner, Walker Percy, who is also a Catholic writer. So much of his his novels by comparison with O'Connor's are extremely, how shall I say, they're very low key, they're very calm. The things that happen to people in the course of his stories are more like the normal things that happen to people. And yet Percy is working at the same thing. One of his novels that is where he uses humor is Love in the Ruins. I love that novel. It's a crazy book. So many insane things happen, and we recognize it as being almost Kurt Vonnegut-like in its craziness. So he uses humor and satire in that book to be able to embody the complexity of being a human being, trying to be a good human being in a world that's gone mad. So Percy is another interesting model. But there, Alice McDermott. Alice is a beautiful writer. She writes about everyday, ordinary people who live everyday, ordinary lives. These people are not terrible, violent things don't happen to them. They go to wakes and they go to funerals. They go to weddings. They get up in the morning and they greet their spouse. They just live the beauty of the ordinary and the pathos of the ordinary is really Alice McDermott's great canvas that she works on. So I love her books as well. Other great Catholic novelists, and it doesn't just have to be Catholics, but I love Ron Hansen's books, for example. His book Marietta in Ecstasy is about a young nun who receives the stigmata at the turn of the 20th century. And there's a question, of course, is it really the stigmata? And what's fascinating about the book is the response of her community to her being marked out as being special. So there's this incursion of the supernatural into the natural world, and then people behave the way that people do. They get jealous, they get angry, they get disappointed, or they get excited. So how do we? And then also he writes his book Atticus is about basically the story of the prodigal son, only written in the 20th century language about 20th century people. So it's I think that everywhere we look, we see extraordinary writers who are able to do what O'Connor says writers are supposed to do, to embody reality, to embody the supernatural in the way that it pervades the natural world in just a huge variety of ways. I hope that answers the question. I hope that helps.
I think so. It seems to have prompted another question from Jill Baumgartner. What advice do you have to give to writers of faith who find their audience an audience of nuns? N-O-N-E-S.
Yes, that is a great question. And as Jill well knows, Jill is a great Flannery O'Connor scholar, as well as a great poetry editor and poet. Um, as Jill knows, O'Connor struggled with this as well. She, even when she was writing in the 1950s and early 1960s, felt that she was largely writing for an audience of unbelievers. And how was she going to get this vision through to them? And this is another reason that she likes to use violence, because let's face it, people love these stories. You know, my students are just blown away by them, and they have seen a lot of, you know, pretty wild, violent stuff. And O'Connor's stories still hold up. So there's a way in which she kind of grabs the reader by the throat, you know, and says, listen, or as she says in one of her letters, you know, you have to sneak up on the reader and clobber him or her when they're not looking. So that was her way of being able to write for the nuns and try to shock them into seeing that there is this this vision, this other world, this divinity that pervades all things. But the question that we're dealing with, the situation we're dealing with, of course, has gotten even more extreme. There are very few people who write from a standpoint of faith, are interested in reading about faith in their writing. This has been a raging controversy. A few years ago, Paul Eli wrote an essay about this in the New York Times, how to make belief believable. And that's Flannery's term as well, how to make belief believable. And I think in terms of advice of how to do that, I mean, I think all that we can do is be absolutely frank and straightforward and honest about who we are and what we do. I used the expression earlier when I was beginning my reading, is I'm helplessly Catholic. I can't explain that away. I can't pretend to be anything that other than what I am. And it's not that I deliberately like load up on Catholic stuff in my poems. It's inevitable. It's going to come out. As Flannery says, the writer writes with the whole personality. And if the whole personality is one that believes, then one is going to inevitably put that into the work. And I suppose hope that one can find a language, an idiom, imagery, situations, subjects that is going to appeal to the non-reader and make them ask questions. You know, what is this? What is Annunciation? I don't know what that is, but I certainly like this poem about this young girl, you know, who's gotten this voice from somewhere and you know, is calling her mother on her cell phone, you know, to tell her about it. So I think it's embedding the reality that believers believe in into the everyday, ordinary lives that we lead is a very, I hope, a very effective way to help them to begin to think about what lies beyond the ordinary reality that we have. It's a really hard question. It's a really hard thing to do. And sometimes it's easier to do it than it is to talk about how to do it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, James Laney has been waiting very patiently with his question about Andalusia. He says, Andalusia, quite a few connotations. Who named it that? And it must have intentionally referenced the original Spanish Andalusia, Granada and so on, the Moorish?
Absolutely. It's an interesting question. It seemed that somebody in Flannery's family, well before her, had named the farm Andalusia, and then the name was kind of lost to history. But when she moved back down there with her mother, she revived the name. She started calling it Andalusia. And I think they're definitely, and part of the reason I wanted to call this book Andalusian Hours is I wanted to allude to that, that there's a kind of wanderlust, I think, that Flannery had. Even though she settled down and she lived faithfully and she took a vow of, you know, stability and basically by living in the place where she lived. But I feel as though there is something in her that just this desire to keep this name Andalusia that wanted to capture something of that old lost world. And in order to, I didn't read any of those poems today, but in order to explore that, there's a whole section in this book of poems that are actually set in Spain. They imagine Flannery imagining herself in Spain. And thinking about flamenco, thinking about Andalusian ponies, reading Spanish writers, Antonio Machado, and trying to figure out what her, or I'm sorry, Garcia Lorca, what her relationship is to that world that her home is named for. In fact, if it's okay, can I read one more poem?
Absolutely.
It actually deals with this very question that you ask. And it's the next to the last poem in the book. It's before Poet's Apology. And it says, it's called Flannery Considers Andalusia at Andalusia. My home is named for a place I've never seen. Red clay and white pine seem tame beside the long kill of bullfights, erotic thrill of flamenco flaming across the bare floor. Regina and I go to mass. Then I write stories about the world I know. I fill pages with places I've been before, places where I feel some sense of kin. I don't see myself traversing so far on this bum leg and this crumbling hip just to find out what's in a name. All the same, if I could arrive by train or by car, I might make the trip. I might know then what Andalusia has to do with Jerusalem.
It's wonderful. This is probably a good question to close with. Amy Wellman says, poetry as a path for the miracle of seeing the world through another's eyes. In a world that seems increasingly paralyzed by political polarization and outrage with the sins of both the present and the past, racism, colonialism, etc. Can you share your insights on the place of poetry in our culture today? And maybe give us a taste of your work, Radical Ambivalence, as well.
Wonderful. What a great question, Amy. Thank you. I really think that poetry is experiencing a kind of rebirth. And part of the reason I think, there's some, first of all, poetry is short. Our attention spans are short. They have gotten a lot shorter. And there's something about the power of poetry to be able to express in a pithy, very brief way, some important idea that people are finding compelling. Just the fact that I made the discovery with my students a couple of years ago that, of course, there are 140, or there used to be 140 characters in a tweet, which is, of course, a very favorite way of communicating. And isn't it wonderful that there are 140 syllables in a sonnet, 14 per line, or 10 per line, 14 lines. It's like the sonnet was it was the original tweet, from Shakespeare's 400 years, we've been tweeting in sonnets. So the very form of poetry speaks to something in us that wants to see order made out of the chaos of the experience that we're living right now. And I think that poetry that can take us out of ourselves, and that's what the gift of poetry does. It brings us out of ourselves by speaking about some very particular experience of a very particular person. This is Flannery O'Connor in 1955, right? But the experience that Flannery is having is a universal experience. It's loneliness, it's love, it's sorrow, it's faith, it's lust, it's terror, it's what drives us all as human beings. And so the poem moves from the particular to the universal and allows us to be somebody else for a while and to see the world through someone else's eyes. We're living in a kind of a difficult time politically in all kinds of ways. For example, channeling, it's hard for some writers to channel people who are really different than them, who are racially different, let's say, or ethnically different. Some writers have really been taken to task about that. I have very complex feelings about it. I understand that, you really shouldn't appropriate somebody else's sensibility for profit, for gain, to exploit them. But I think that the imagination has to be free to go where it needs to go. And so I really wish that we could arrive at a reasonable place where we can be able to imagine ourselves into other kinds of lives, because that's the source of our salvation. That's the source of us being able to get along as human beings in the world. And so I will say a couple of words about the book that's just coming out, actually. It's very strange to have two books come out in the same year, in the same month, that are about the same person. This has never happened to me before, and probably won't happen again, but this book is new. It's Race in Flannery O'Connor, and it's a study of O'Connor's attitudes towards race. And one of the things that was interesting to me in doing this work for this book, which was so different than the work I did for the poetry book, is O'Connor lived at a time when there was also a lot of division. The world between Black and white people was absolutely segregation, as Flannery says in one of her letters. Segregation is segregation. She knew nothing about the world of Black people. Black people, however, knew something about the world of white people because they worked with white people. And there are a few poems in this book about this, by the way, about this difficulty that O'Connor had when it came to really being able to understand her fellow Black Americans. So it's very interesting to see her struggle with this because there were no opportunities to really be able to cross that barrier, to cross that line. We are fortunate to live in a time when we do have the opportunity to do that. We have so many excellent African American writers, Hispanic American writers, Latino writers, writers who are Indian, writers who are Pakistani, writers who are Israeli, writers who, I mean, we are just blessed with this incredible outpouring of art by writers of every possible identity. And we have no excuse not to have the divisions that we have because this is a grace. This is a blessing, you know, that is given to us. So I think that one of the ways in which we increase and enlarge our sensibilities is by reading as much as possible. And then reading people people whose identities are different from ours, whose lives are different than ours. The ancient poet, haiku writer Basho once said about writing, it's like being alive twice. Reading is like being alive twice, being alive 1,000 times. There are 1,000 lives that we can lead. I became a literature teacher not because I was looking for a job. It's because I somehow figured this out when I was a young person, and I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life reading other people's writing and then helping other people to enjoy and to read that writing as well. So if that's what poetry can do for us, if that's what literature can do for us, then it can. We always have this this opportunity in front of us to enlarge our sensibilities and to become better people.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Angela. There's been a slew of outpouring of thanks and praise for your work in the chat bar. So we'll be sure that you see all those messages. I'll pass all those on, everyone, I promise. But really, just thank you so much for, again, teaching us and reading to us today. This has been an incredible time together. And I'm sure that thank you to everyone who joined us. You all enjoyed it as much as we did. Just to let you know again that Angela's books, Andalusian Hours, The Province of Joy, and Still Pilgrim are all available from your local booksellers and of course from Paraclete Press. And they can be purchased on our website, paracletepress.com at 20% off right now. And free shipping is also available this month on orders over $45. So we would ask you to please consider gifting these books to all the Flannery lovers and poetry lovers that you know, all your friends and family, because your generosity will help support Angela and Paraclete Press in our ongoing work and providing free webinars such as this one today. So we hope you enjoyed this time together as much as we did. Our prayers are with all of you for health and safety, and we hope you'll join us for more of these times together with our authors. Our calendar of Zoom events is available on our website, paracletepress.com. So God bless you, Angela, all of you who are watching. Thank you again so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care. See you soon.